Hi, everybody. Today I'd like to talk to you about the linguistic mass extinction that's going on Earth right now. First, we'll talk about the current death of languages. Then I'd like to talk about why this is so harmful to cultures around the world and what we need to do to save this from happening in the future. Firstly, we need to identify what is happening to languages around the world today. According to the UNESCO Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger, 43% of all the 6,000 languages on Earth are endangered, with a death rate of about 26 languages per year. At this speed, about half of the world's languages will be dead within the next 100 years. So what's causing this mass extinction of languages around the world? Well, according to Paul Jorgensen, top-to-bottom language death occurs when the upper class of a society starts using a different language, by choice or by force. They may choose to teach their children a more global language to give their children an advantage in the greater society. People may also be forced by an upper class to change languages. For example, this is what happened in Hawaii in the 1890s when the United States usurped the Kingdom of Hawaii through military force and forced the English language upon the native Hawaiians. There's simply no corner of the Earth not affected by this mass extinction. Every region of the world seems to have one or more dominant languages that in modern times have become so invasive as to have squeezed out any last native speakers like an anaconda. Just to name a few, there are languages like English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Swahili, and many more. Now that we've established the wide-reaching tentacles of language death, we have to ask, is this really a big problem, or could this be a good thing? In her paper titled "The Relationship Between Culture and Language," Wen-Ying Jiang represents language as the flesh of society, with culture being the blood. Without one, the other can't function. Let's take America's favorite pastime as an example of culture: baseball. Imagine you turn on the TV and you hear the announcer say, "Next up to the Mesto, Babe Ruth, hoping to bring in another Dombieg for the Voshishnis." This makes no sense. Why would an American sport being played by American players be announced in Russian? If we're going to play baseball in Russian, does that mean we have to change the common phrase three-strike rule or on deck to the three Wachstatt rule or on Meshto? The cultural practice of baseball has affected our everyday speech so much that there's no way to express these thoughts effectively in Russian. You can't put type A blood in a type B body, the same way you can't play baseball in Russian without sacrificing parts of English-speaking American culture. For years, people have hypothesized that if by some miracle every person on Earth spoke one language, it would be a step towards global peace. David Crystal argues this in his book, Language Death. Quote, "The examples to the contrary are so numerous that it would be impractical to list them. Suffice it to say that all the major monolingual countries of the world have had their civil wars, and that as one reflects on the war zones of the world in the last decades of the 20th century, it is striking just how many of them are in countries which are predominantly monolingual." End quote. To name a few recent civil wars in predominantly monolingual countries, there are countries like Korea, Vietnam, Germany, Russia, Rwanda, and even the United States. There's simply absolutely no statistical evidence that linguistic homogeny promotes peace or that linguistic diversity promotes violence. Next, I'd like to look at how languages are suppressed. The first method for a group to suppress a language is through sheer annoyance and convenience. The best example of this is the Republic of France. Within her borders, France has three native languages: French, Breton, and Basque. Imagine you are an expecting parent living in the Basque country of France. You have a decision to make. Should you raise your child as a Basque or French native speaker? If you were to raise your child in your native tongue, they will be able to experience all of what your culture and history has to offer, but they will never be able to comfortably go to school, to a movie theater, or get a job in French outside of your small countryside. If you decide to raise your child as a French speaker, they will lose all of their 2,000 years of history, old tales, stories, and Basque culture, but they will be perfectly comfortable at school and in every other part of global life. Unfortunately, even today, many parents are forced to take the latter approach because the French government refuses to offer a normal and comfortable life to anybody who does not conform to their culture in the name of national unity. The second way countries suppress languages is through brutal force. In the United States, during the long period of slavery in the South, the native languages of the enslaved people were literally beaten out of them. If a male slave was caught speaking an African language, it was common practice that the slave would be muzzled and whipped and otherwise tortured, with repeated offenses often resulting in the removal of a man's tongue with a hot knife. Punishments were similar for female slaves, except it was much more common for them to also be sexually exploited and otherwise sexually abused before other forms of punishment. Cases of human rights violations based on languages are unfortunately numerous and will continue if we don't fight them. We can talk about the damaging effects of language death all day, but what can we actually do to help? Luckily, we're not the first people to discuss how to revitalize a language. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Eliezer Ben Yehuda laid out his 7 steps for language revitalization, in his case being for Hebrew. Number 1 was to speak the native language in the home. Number 2 was to call on those abroad to learn their native language. Number 3 was to establish a native language speaking society. Number 4 was to establish the native language as the primary language of education. Number 5 was to write newspapers and other common literature in that native language. Number 6 was to write an official dictionary for your native language. And the last would be to establish a linguistic council to standardize the language for all speakers. For a modern example of this, we can look at the Winnebago language spoken in the Ho-Chunk Nation in Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction has a small program in place now for language revitalization. Quote, a school board or a cooperative education service agency may apply to the department for a grant for the purpose of supporting innovative, effective instruction in one or more American Indian languages. These types of grants are integral to the funding of language revitalization efforts. Lobbying for more grants and further monetary support for the native infrastructure is the most important thing we can do to get the government to help. But you might be thinking, what can I do in my daily life to help? The most important thing to always remember is to normalize native languages. Don't treat languages as something foreign or something to stare at. Instead, learn a few words in a regional native language. There's nothing more affirming to a damaged society than to personally legitimize their language. Personally recognize that on their land we speak their language, and there's nothing wrong with participating. Next time you're on a native reservation, do a quick Google search on how to say hello or thank you in their language. The more the young native children see mutual respect from both sides of the border, the more they will feel empowered to learn and speak their native language. Due to the widespread use of English on the internet and the lack of government support, younger native generations are much less likely to speak native languages. The problem with this is that it only takes one generation to kill a language. If we don't take this problem seriously right now, we will lose hundreds of languages and dialects in the United States and Canada alone. There is, however, good news to report. When it comes to the societal view of native languages, in their book, quote, Saving Languages, Lenore Grenoble and Lindsay Whaley write, quote, to this we must add a second major socio-historical shift, the general trend towards recognizing the rights of minorities, both as individuals and as groups, within modern nation-states. They go on to say that surveys and studies show the percentage of Americans who say they care about indigenous culture or care about their languages is rising quite fast. This is very encouraging news for us because we can see that things we do as outsiders have real effects. The number of young Native Americans who say that their tribe's language is important to them is slowly rising. The future of minority languages is up to us. We can allow 43% of the world's cultures to die, or we can choose to save our beautiful human tapestry. Today we looked at how languages die, why they die, and what we can do to prevent it. I'd like to leave you with this core idea. We don't have 3 strikes when it comes to a person's culture. Flesh can't work without blood, and blood can't work without flesh. Thank you.